study design, we'll talk about a cross-sectional study design. But to recap real quick, we just covered cohort study design and case control study design. And I called those the two main tools that an epidemiologist will use in his toolbox. Why those two studies and not the other studies? One of the aims of epidemiology is to determine the etiology of a disease. That is, to determine the cause of a disease. Both case control and cohort studies have directionality. So that is that there is some difference in time from when the exposure happened to when the disease happened. We said that a cohort study is much better at determining the temporal relationship between exposure and disease because we know that exposure happened before disease. But at least a case control study does have some directionality. So depending on the exposure and disease and depending on how you collect data, you might have an okay argument that there is possibly a temporal relationship there. That is very different from a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is a snapshot in time. That means it has no directionality. So it's right here. We simultaneously assess the exposure status in individuals of the population and the outcome status in individuals of the population. So we have one start time. A very common way to collect data for a cross-sectional study is by use of a survey, sometimes an interview. I can guarantee that all of you, before you finish your MPH, will have conducted a cross-sectional study design because they are so common in public health. Just because they do not have directionality and cannot establish causality of disease does not mean that they're not of value. What frequency of measure can we determine from a cross-sectional study design? We can determine prevalence. Sometimes a cross-sectional study design is called a prevalence study because we can assess the proportion of people who have the outcome over the population size. Sometimes we organize this data in what's called a 2x2 table. We'll become much more familiar with this next quarter, so consider this a preview of organizing data this way. But it's a very good way to organize and visualize your data. So let's see if we can make sense of it. There's two statuses for exposure and two statuses for outcome. So the number of possible combinations is 2 times 2, or 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes. That's why it's called a 2x2 table. Typically we put disease status on top of the box. And we break them up in their 2 categories. So that is that the outcome is dichotomized. We put exposure status to label the rows. So if a person is exposed and has the disease, we would count them in that box. If a person is exposed and does not have a disease, we put them in that box. Not exposed, does have a disease. Not exposed, does not have a disease. From there, we can compare different proportions. So let this be a quick review on some of the measures of frequency. So this would be the proportion of exposed individuals who has the disease. The proportion of unexposed individuals who have the disease. Now, let's say we're talking about a risk factor exposure and a disease as the health outcome. So let's say smoking and lung cancer. We would expect those who were exposed to have the disease at a higher proportion than those not exposed. That would be our hypothesis. So we would expect this proportion to be larger than this proportion. Again, the math of that we'll get into more next quarter, but the idea of prevalence, proportion, ratios, and the different study designs are knowledge that you should obtain this quarter. So I mentioned a couple of the limitations of a cross-sectional study design, but what's its advantage? Well, its advantage is that it's easy to conduct and therefore quick and inexpensive. I said that a case control study design is a very good first study to conduct when you have a good hypothesis about if an association exists between an exposure and an outcome. But where does that hypothesis come from? It probably came from a cross-sectional study design, or even maybe an ecologic study design. So these are really your very first step in assessing or seeing associations